everyone, welcome to another episode of Essential Bytes, conversations on digital trends and how they're shaping the industry. I'm Nicole Monge, and with me are my co-hosts, Andre Smith and Dan Smith. Today, we welcome Stephanie Stouffer, an APCO alumna and current strategy director at Phone2Action. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Essential Bytes. Today, we're joined by Stephanie Stouffer, who's the Director of Strategic Accounts at Phone2Action, and I'll turn it over to her to introduce what Phone2Action is.
Hey guys, this is Stephanie, and Phone2Action is an all-service government affairs platform. So we help organizations, whether they are nonprofits, trade associations, or corporations, identify new advocates, engage them in policy issues, and ultimately have more of an impact in the legislatures that these organizations are focused on. So we do everything from stakeholder management to standard grassroots campaigns.
Cool. Thanks, Steph. Yeah, we're really excited to be joined by Stephanie today because it's a tool that we deploy a lot at APCO and a lot of our clients use. So we're really excited to talk about its role in sort of the advocacy boom that we're seeing. And I think, we'll start with a couple of questions just to get the conversation going. And with that, I'll let Andre kick us off.
Yeah, again, welcome, Stephanie. We're really excited to have you. And like Nicole said, we really wanted to focus this episode on this boom in advocacy that we've seen. 2020, we've labeled, and a lot of people probably would agree, it has been unprecedented. And as a result, we've seen this large boom and swell in advocacy. And so we wanted to ask you, can you talk a little bit about this rise of advocacy that you've seen at Phone2Action?
Yeah, I'll tell y'all what, it's been unprecedented is definitely the word of the year. And that goes to not only the issues that this country is dealing with and facing, but also on a more micro level, a much more micro level, the number of campaigns, the level of activity that we've seen in our platform. So we have broken pretty much every record that we have ever tracked over the course of the history of our company. Conversion rates are the highest they've ever been. Engagement rates are the highest they've ever been. We've seen millions and millions and millions of messages be delivered to lawmakers. And one of the biggest differentiators that we've seen this year as opposed to years prior is the level of customization that advocates are using in their letters to lawmakers. And so that's been really awesome to see, because as people have these really emotional and impactful stories that they want to share, they're finding ways to do that and finding ways to really personalize those typical, grassroots messages that we've seen for, decades up until this point. So yeah, I think it's a combination of, COVID-19, we're under, major economic recession. And then we've also seen, some record-breaking, civil disruption and civil conversations happening about racial issues and, community issues, and a lot of these things that just really tug at people's heartstrings. So, I think unprecedented is the best way to describe it. It's probably an overused word at this point, but it's been really fun to be part of it and to see all of it unfold.
Gotcha. One question that I had, and you touched on it, about the factors that kind of contributed to this kind of rise in advocacy from social issues and the COVID-19 pandemic. In the past, when especially around social issues with some of the past killings of Trayvon Martin, did you see a slight increase then when it came to advocacy, or was it more or less a perfect kind of storm of not only George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, but also the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the past, it's been more specific to the organizations that focus already on social and racial injustice issues, right? So I think what's really different this year is that other organizations outside of your typical civil justice groups are taking it upon themselves to message around racial inequality and some of these other, social items that, we've all been facing. And that's been really interesting to watch too, from just a brand perspective, to see, what organizations are harnessing this as a way to communicate out to their stakeholders, whether those are employees or customers or otherwise, about issues that maybe don't necessarily align with their branding or some of these other kind of more traditional things that these companies think about. and yet they're still embracing it as something that is extremely important to be proactively communicating about and connecting those people in with, you know, their lawmakers or other decision makers that they're dealing with. I think you did touch on a point. We are at a really critical moment right now where emotions are really high. You're dealing with, you know, unprecedented unemployment. And so there's a lot of other factors that I think are certainly contributing to the level of engagement that we've seen, especially around, you know, the BLM movement and otherwise. But at the same time, I think it also just speaks to more of the, you know, widespread acceptance that this is a conversation that has been long overdue, that, you know, really isn't off limits for anybody.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And kind of moving along, and when we're thinking about advocacy, you know, there are, a wide variety of questions that come with advocacy, that come with, you know, why should I speak up? How should I speak up? You know, what are the things that I need to be asking people in organizations in particular? What are some of those critical questions that you have, that organizations are being asked right now? What have you been hearing? What have you been seeing?
Yeah, it's so the conversations that I have with folks is usually on the corporate side, and they sort of fall on one of two sides of the fence. The first being, you know, oh gosh, you know, there's a lot going on right now, and we're just not really sure if this is our time and place to engage, or we're not really sure. We want to wait till things calm down, perhaps, you know, before we start to, you know, communicating with our advocates or, you know, communicating with our employees. And then on the flip side, the other folks are saying, look at all of these opportunities that we're going to miss out on if we don't harness this energy and use it for, you know, our own purposes. From, you know, the corporate perspective, especially for some of the more traditional industries, so to speak, the, you know, transportation industry, the energy industry, you know, some of these other folks that are being hit more by the recession. There's a lot of opportunity in Congress right now for, and even at the state legislatures, for them to have an impact. So my message to everybody is don't wait, because even if you did want to wait and maybe not engage right this minute, it's a great time to lay the groundwork for what we're going to ultimately see in 2021, which is obviously still very unclear, just given the uncertainty with state legislatures and whether they will be convening or how they'll be convening or when. But nonetheless, they will at some point have to convene and have to start legislating again. And so it's time for those, you know, those groups to be prepared for that. So, and I think from an issues perspective too, it sort of is related, where a lot of these businesses are asking, where are the opportunities for them to maybe get more federal funding by encouraging their grassroots to send, you know, letters in, or, you know, make sure that they're not forgotten in some of these relief bill conversations. On the flip side too, from the social perspective, it's maybe this is our time to speak up, and this is our time to be more proactive about some of these issues that we've maybe been more timid to address in the past. It's just, I think, a really perfect timing for advocacy, no matter which way you look at it and no matter which angle you're coming from.
And jumping in, and I welcome everyone's kind of thoughts on this, but something that you just said, Stephanie, is something that I think is something that we are navigating a lot, as well as, you know, practitioners, in that, you know, clients, like we see this need, and we see, you know, people really calling for, you know, this type of advocacy that actually influences change, but we don't know how to authentically engage in a way that doesn't feel like advantageous for us, but still, you know, gives us some sort of voice in the conversation. How have you guys been navigating that? Like, what have you been telling people, clients, like whomever it is? Because I think that is something that a lot of organizations and companies are really grappling with.
Yeah, that's absolutely something that we have been challenged by a lot too. And I think what the answer that we have found is that, again, going back to my point about personalized and customized messages, I think is the biggest opportunity to create that authenticity and make sure that you're not putting words in someone's mouth. Mm-hmm. You know, the traditional approach to grassroots and to advocacy has been a form letter, right? Where a corporate comms team sits and writes their perfectly scripted messaging and makes sure that it, you know, aligns with the branding and aligns with what legal wants to say and aligns with, you know, what the public policy team wants to say, and, you know, kind of checks all these boxes. But in reality, a normal average citizen probably doesn't speak that way, first of all. And secondly, might not even fully understand what it is that they're saying in that message. Even if it is written at 8th grade reading level, it might still be about topics that don't necessarily impact their day-to-day livelihoods when they, come home from work, or in this case, shut their computers down. And so that's where embracing that level of customization can be really, really differentiating, and also provide that opportunity for people to share their personal messages and share their personal stories.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that makes a lot of sense, especially as we know how people like to engage with each other and with companies and organizations. It's all about customization, and it's all about feeling like you're talking to a person, because people, users, whether you're looking at social or, when we did have in real life, people are so inundated with content and with things to care about and with things to sort of push for, that it has to feel like it's connected to them in somehow. So that customization piece, I think, really speaks to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I also feel like, especially everything that's happened, we're definitely seeing this level of scrutiny when it comes to empathy, right? Like, I mean, messages have to have a certain level of empathy now, and consumers are cognizant very cognizant of when they don't. And so that corporate speak, or that kind of just corporate jargon, so to speak, I think that, that's going away very, 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 very quickly.
I was just going to say, Dre, to echo you, I think one great byproduct of the transition we're seeing in this rising social consciousness is the old statement where you plug and play. We as an organization are no longer going to stand for this, and then you don't have any substantive action associated with it is gone. And there is that requirement now to go beyond having corporate social responsibility set out as a goal. You need to be taking concrete action to make a difference around these issues. And I think that's a great thing that we've seen come out of this advocacy boom. You've touched on something, Stephanie, you've touched on a lot of the questions that we're getting ready to ask you, which I appreciate, shows we're on the right track. One other thing I want to ask you specifically around how organizations are standing out from the crowd. How do you engage and mobilize people when there's so much to pay attention to? I think we understand the ways that organizations can customize messages and tailor messages, and that's important from the perspective of finding something that resonates. But how do we really get people to engage and mobilize around these issues when there's so much that they have been, as Nicole said, inundated with in the past 6 months?
Yeah, and we're all sitting at our computers most of the day, at least the majority of us are. And so, you see the emails kind of come in, and yet you still have that habit of just like deleting it, or no, I don't really need to open that one, or whatnot. And so the way around that is still with text messaging, right? Like, I mean, this is still a really powerful device to reach people on, despite the fact that they might not be quite as on the go as they used to be. That's where we've seen, I think, the most success from a lot of organizations. Just to throw a statistic at you, the American Nurses Association had a 30% conversion rate on one of their text message calls to action. To put that into perspective, your average conversion rate across the board on an advocacy campaign hovers around 6%. So you're looking at a 5x conversion rate on just sending a text message to advocates and saying, hey, we need your voice right now. So that's a really great way to get in front of people. Text messages are typically a 90% open rate within the first 2 hours of receiving them. So it's just, when you think about the statistics of, opening an email versus, opening a text message, I think that's a great way. It's also just a lot shorter. It's more to the point, and just gets people's attention that way. I think too, social media is another piece that we have seen a huge increase in this year. I mean, it's just been unbelievable, the level of increase we've seen on Facebook and on Twitter, and in people sharing campaigns as well, and then recruiting their friends and family to join from those campaigns. So, really leveraging that snowball effect of that social share and, those secondary and tertiary audiences that you may not have thought about just yet, can be really helpful for, reaching people that way too.
Well, it's super interesting, and you've touched on something, social media by virtue of the pandemic is no longer supplemental. It is central to what we are doing in terms of our social lives, but also in terms of how we can engage on these issues. And I do want to go back to something you just said quickly. Are you seeing generally in this increase, you mentioned social media, you mentioned text messaging. Has that been kind of the center of the increase in advocacy? Are you still seeing it in email marketing as well? Or is it more so on the social and the text side?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think if you looked at all of the data across the board, everything is like going up, right? It's like, it's practically a hockey stick, increase from what we've seen in the last few months. That being said, I think the sexier and the more impressive statistics are probably from the social side. So, for example, we've seen a 411% increase in social shares on Facebook. So 400% increase on Facebook, 150% increase on Twitter. And then one of the kind of major, sticking points or the results of that is when those advocates are recruited from social, that newly recruited advocate is now 7,000% more likely to take action on another campaign and become a returning advocate. A 7,000% more likely.
Small number.
I mean, that's like those are numbers that like I can't even quite comprehend. Like, how are you now 7,000% more likely? I guess that means that you were like maybe not likely at all, and now you're very likely to, return. But nonetheless, I mean, that's a really critical point for a lot of organizations to leverage that. And that means that they have so much more potential to expand that audience, and that advocate population than they did before. And so, and those are increases too that we're seeing, continue. I mean, obviously the major increases happened sort of at the beginning of all of this. There was a lot of activity at the very beginning around the very first waves of, relief funding out of Congress with PPE and hospitals and all of that kind of stuff. But we are seeing, those trends continue. They've plateaued a little bit, of course. But nonetheless, as we gear up for, the election and otherwise, there's, still a lot to be done.
Something you just touched on, it's crazy to think about, but we could be seeing even more of an increase in the coming months around the election. And it'll be hard to believe that we can exceed that 7,000% increase in terms of folks who have engaged, but we'll have to see.
Something that I'm curious about, and it's something that you had sort of touched on before, Steph, but I'm curious what everyone kind of thinks of this. I think that we've seen advocacy come and go in waves throughout periods of history. Like there's definite spikes and then decreases. Do we think that we're only going to continue to see this sort of increase in desire for advocacy and actually like people taking action, or do we see a potential decrease? Like what do people like project around that?
Yeah, I mean, I can go first, and then I would love to hear y'all's thoughts too. I think we are going to continue to see an increase. There's certainly a generational shift taking place that is really important. It's we've sort of deemed this new citizen, right? When we are, looking at things and talking to our clients, we talk about the new citizen, and the new citizen is, of course, younger, but they're also more empowered by technology. They're more empowered by that storytelling and the opportunity to share their own unique perspective and their own voice. We've seen, obviously, millennials and Gen Xers are, sort of taking the cake in terms of engagement, but I think we're going to see the generations start to get even younger, and Gen Z. I mean, we've seen this just separate from Phone2Action, but you've seen, the TikTok movements happening with Gen Z around, the Trump rally and the fact that they reserved all of these tickets, or, they're starting to share all of this political content. And so it's going to be really interesting to watch how that affects the way that organizations are communicating to the public about different issues. But nonetheless, I do think that we're going to continue to see an increase in, this level of advocacy, and especially as, people start to be more comfortable in talking to their elected officials, and they're realizing that, especially now with the BLM movement, I think that one of the best parts of that has been the refocus on local legislators. And the fact that a lot of people are now messaging going into November, talking about your down ballot races being potentially more important for your community than some of those top of the ticket races. And so I think that message is going to continue to resonate with people who are maybe new to advocacy and haven't yet, taken that opportunity to engage. But, we'll see what happens. But yeah, I would love y'all's perspective on that too. Well,
and I think the point that you just made is one that I've been thinking about too, around this next wave of advocates, and the fact that the audiences are going to just obviously get younger and younger as the generations go on, and the way in which they mobilize is adapting. And I think, as to your point, we've seen that with TikTok and the way that they've engaged there. And so it's really interesting to see. But I actually think, as the generations get younger and start to move up in their sort of advocacy voice, I predict also that it keeps increasing because they're so vocal, and in a lot of the right ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I mean, yeah, I won't belabor it. I agree with that, what you said, Nicole. What you said. I think that especially now as technology evolves, as we see new platforms, we'll see new waves and new forms of advocacy among all different audience groups, but especially really driven by these younger, more vocal generations. I think that at this point we're at a point where people are empowered to speak up, and Steph, you touched on it, especially with BLM and everything that's going on from a racial justice standpoint, really at this local level, which in the past has been absent. Especially within the African American community, there hasn't been a strong emphasis on that. Your local legislation, your local governments, but now with the advent of this advocacy boom, coupled with technology and various platforms, we're just seeing this at an all-time high, and it will continue to increase.
So true. And we try not to always agree on the show, but I think we can all agree on this concept of the new citizen. I love that term, because it really is. It's someone who is active in their community, who's engaging on issues, who is socially conscious, who is pushing corporations and organizations to take a stand on the issues that they believe in. I know that APCO Insight had done some research recently into what folks expect of organizations and corporations, and it was something in the neighborhood of 90% believe that in addition to looking out essentially for their bottom line, that corporations should be contributing good to society. And that is a number that I don't think we would have seen in the past. I think it speaks to the rising social consciousness and that new citizen that you mentioned, Stephanie. So I'm going to steal that term. Sorry in advance.
It is a good one.
It is a good one. So yeah. you got to take it when you can get it. One question that maybe comes out of this is, what role do corporations have to play in issue-based advocacy, and how can they get involved authentically? I think that's a question that Nicole asked earlier. Avoiding seeming opportunistic, it's a challenge that our clients face. What advice can you have from your perspective in y'all's work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in terms of trying to figure out, ways to get involved, I think it kind of comes down to are you a mission-driven organization? And if you are, then you should absolutely be leaning into that and be using that to push, policy issues that, align with that mission. So you think about some of the bigger, consumer brands that have taken it upon themselves to be really aggressive in the way that they're marketing their products and the way that they're talking to their customers. And then ultimately, tying it back into, communicating with elected officials and, making that, connection happen. But I think too, there's now a responsibility on behalf of the private sector to do some of this issue education too, because you are seeing such stagnation in the policy world, in the federal Congress especially. And so I think that's a great chance for a lot of companies to be more forward thinking on that. And we're starting to see a lot of that pick up, of course, with the election this year. I mean, election engagement has been an issue that corporations have harnessed for, several cycles now. We've been tracking data since 2016, but 2020 is by far the biggest year so far for, registering to vote and looking up your polling place and some of these just very neutral and very safe civic engagement activities. And we're seeing some of the largest companies in the US, financial institutions, insurance companies, like these really old and regulated and maybe like used to be outdated organizations are looking at this and saying, hey, it's on us to be proactively educating our employees about why they should be voting on November the 3rd or why they should be mailing in their ballots 2 weeks before November the 3rd.
Well, and to the point that you were making, like it's almost like a scale, right? Like there's some of these more like civically neutral things that companies can be educating their employees on, encouraging them to be active on, and then there's some that are really out there actually advocating on behalf of specific, legislation or specific issues. And so I think it to the point that you were making, it depends on like how involved they ultimately want to be, but it doesn't have to be like all the super extreme or not, it can be sort of that neutral territory too.
we're in an interesting spot because we sit on so much data. We know the pain points, some of the obstacles, the blockades that the larger consumer and specific demographics are faced with, and those issues that affect them directly. And so it has been disingenuous to know the issues, know the data, but not touch on that, or not even educate and empower employees to go out and begin to rectify those. So I think now, that issue-based education is extremely integral into, how consumers view these organizations, but really how employees view their employers.
You touched on something there too, Dre, that we've been talking a lot about rising social consciousness and how corporations and organizations, and then on the other side of it, individuals, the grassroots, there's this unified collective, and we all have this responsibility. But what specific role do you think, Stephanie, that employees play in that advocacy, and how can corporations and organizations like ours do a better job of engaging their employees to get active about these issues, and what role can they play?
Yeah, and I would, urge you, put yourselves in the shoes of a lobbyist, or even in the shoes of a legislator, right? I mean, even at the state level, when you're hearing a message directly from, the vice president of government affairs for a Fortune 20 organization, sure, that's a great message to hear, and you're going to hear a lot of statistics about, economic revenue into your district, and number of employees, or number of suppliers, or number of facilities in your district, and all of these kind of statistics about maybe why that legislator needs to care about that company. But if you hear a story from a person who's actually worked for that company for 30 years and says, this, my father worked here, and my father's father worked here, and I'm now able to put food on my family's table because I now work here, and if you don't pass this legislation, I'm going to lose my job, that definitely is going to have more of an impact than just the message from the lobbyist. Now, granted, the message from the lobbyist is just as important too. I mean, it is very important in that process, of course, but there has to be both sides of the coin to, really stand out from a lot of the other organizations who are trying to get their points across. And, not to beat a dead horse on customization, but that's really where those personal stories can have an impact. And even just from a technical standpoint, we're all digital strategists here. More and more legislative offices are adopting technology that weed out form letters, but there's protocols in place for legislative staff to respond to personal messages that are different from form letters. And so you're naturally taking up more of their time by sending all of these personal messages, which, ultimately they're going to, end up reaching the actual official at a certain point if, you're actually having that much success. And so, that's really where a lot of that can become really valuable in terms of how the traditional government affairs route can work in parallel with grassroots and advocacy. I always tell people, with organizations that say, oh, well, we don't do grassroots. I always tell them, this is just a tool in the toolbox. I'm not suggesting that you replace your government affairs team or that you replace yourself as a lobbyist. It's more so this is just another tactic to have in your back pocket that can help your message resonate in a more personal and human way than perhaps just sending over a fact sheet about, where all of your suppliers are.
Very true. I actually, I'm going to date myself a little bit here, but a couple of years ago at what is now the Apple Store, but used to be an event center here in DC, I had a chance to attend an event that y'all put on that was all about advocacy and the ways in which it's changing. And I think it was maybe your colleague, Will Lopez, who was talking about how 90% of Congress was now on Facebook and Twitter. And it's just so interesting to think about how that, as you said, and that's going to probably blow a lot of people's minds. Oh, my form letter is actually just going into a little folder over here. And I need to start thinking about these different ways to reach folks because they do care about that Facebook post. They do care about the tweets that are coming in. And there is more of an appetite for that kind of advocacy than there ever was in the past. That transition, I think, is really interesting. And as I'm sure, as you said earlier, it's gone into hyperdrive in the past 6 months.
Twitter especially is a place where you see a lot of lawmakers managing their own accounts. And, they're sitting there in hearings or during votes and they're flipping through their Twitter feeds. So what better time to get in front of them than, to send a call to action 25 minutes before a hearing begins and direct a bunch of tweets into the lawmaker that you're trying to reach. And then all of a sudden, as that lawmaker sits down to start, going through this process, and they're doing what we all do and pulling their phones out, they're all of a sudden getting inundated with all of these tweet replies saying, hey, like, we really need you to vote on this issue, or this is really important to me. And so it's a really easy way to reach those decision makers. And, again, that's, just an authentic message to be delivering that, can really be helpful and, personalize that message.
It's so interesting too, because I think for so long, it felt like even with these officials being on social media, it was like, oh, staff handles that, or there's like somebody that's actually moderating that. And now it's like, no, that's like the real person. Like, they are actually like managing their own channels, and they're like paying attention to what people are saying, because this is where people are talking about it.
Right.
Yeah, I always like to remind people that like elected officials are just like us. They're like, they're also just humans. And yeah, I mean, like, to a certain point. And so they get bored and pick up their phones in a meeting too, just like the rest of us do. And so, why not try to take advantage of that, and why not try to reach them that way?
Yeah.
Right. And to go back to the question that we had posed before in terms of where do we see advocacy going in the future, I mean, that's why I feel like it would only increase, because, I now know that I have a direct line of communication with my elected official, and I literally, any issue that I have, anything that is literally, impacting me on my day-to-day, I can go directly, get a phone to action and then send it to them.
100%. It comes back to the 3 words I think we have talked about a lot on this show in the early going, and that's authenticity, transparency, and accountability. And all of that plays such a distinct role in this this advocacy boom that we've been talking about. I know we're running kind of short on time that we have with you today, so I want to put you on the spot, Stephanie. If you could sum it up in one sentence, what does the future of advocacy look like?
I
knew this was coming. And
a challenge to it too. If you could choose one word to describe the future of advocacy, what would it be?
I think local is my word. And it goes back to my original point about, I think we are going to see a really big surge in people communicating more proactively and paying a lot closer attention to what's happening within their communities, within their local governments. That will obviously trickle up into the state level governments, but nonetheless, I really think that that's where the opportunity is going to come into play. County commissioners are another elected body that people oftentimes forget about, but actually have a lot of power and decision making over, policies that truly impact people's day to day. So I think that's probably where we're headed, especially as, Congress continues to move at the pace of an iceberg. I think that's where the opportunity is going to be too.
Ray, what was your word?
I'm going to go back to my earlier notion of empathy. I think that is something that is extremely, has been very apparent since this year in 2020. But I think it will be, have a bullseye on it moving forward. Between, personalized messaging, the ability for an individual or citizen to actually go out and reach their elected official directly. And really it's about empathy. And I think, prior to, this year, we typically didn't infuse empathy into our communication, in our day-to-day, but this has really kind of woken us up. So for me, it would be empathy.
Dan?
Oh, okay. I should have been prepared for this. I will say collective, because I think that one thing we've seen come out of this is so many different factions, politically, ideologically, have come together around some core issues in terms of public health and racial justice, and this renewed fight for social equality, unlike maybe anything that we've seen before. And I think that is really encouraging. And if we continue to use the tools that we have at our disposal, those collectives can only grow. So I'm going to take a rosy outlook on the future and say collective. How about you, Nicole?
Okay, and that's it. Bye. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to say charged. I think that people are more empowered than ever before to advocate for the change that they ultimately want for themselves and their communities and their lives. And I also take a rosy outlook on it, and that I think people will continue to, because I think what we've seen is they have to take these issues in their own hands, because that's the only way things change. So I think people feel more charged and empowered than ever before, and I think they'll continue to.
Absolutely.
I'm with it.
Cool. All right. Well, Stephanie, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, this was
really
so fun.
Fun discussion for us. Like we love doing these jam sessions, so really appreciate it. And
if we geek out over advocacy, it's perfect.
Love to do that. And with that, thanks everyone for tuning in, and be sure to check back for the next episode of Essential Bytes.
Hey guys, Andre here. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Remember, we want to hear from you. Let us know your thoughts on future topics, if you want to join the show. And of course, as always, we want you to keep the conversation going. See you in the next episode of Essential Bytes. Cheers.